So we've reached the end of our logic unit, lesson 41, Pascal's Wager. Now Pascal's Wager is named after Blaise Pascal. Now Blaise Pascal was a 17th century French mathematician and scientist. He is considered to be the father of modern probability theory. He created the first calculating machine, invented the syringe, developed the hydraulic press, and refined the barometer for measuring atmospheric pressure. So Pascal gave a lot of contributions to the scientific world. However, he is best known in philosophical and theological circles for Pascal's Wager, the suggestion that it is better to believe in the existence of God than to be an atheist, for the simple reason that it is the bet that gives the better chance for a good outcome. And it's fairly simple when you look at Pascal's Wager. Essentially, you have one of two choices. You can either choose to believe in God or you can choose not to believe in God. And there's two possible outcomes. God does exist, God doesn't exist. And if you look at these, two of these are very small potatoes. It really is not going to affect you one way or the other. So if you don't believe in God and God doesn't exist, whatever, it's not a big deal. If God doesn't exist and you do believe in God, again, not a big deal. Now, this side is a big deal. If God exists and you don't believe in God, you get an infinity of pain and suffering, and oftentimes this is looked at as hell. Horrible, horrible outcome. You wouldn't wish it upon your worst enemy. Now, if you do believe in God and God exists, you get an infinity of happiness and joy and pleasure and goodness. Obviously, something we would all want. So Pascal said, listen, given these four options, I'm going to bet on this one. You'd be a fool not to. And that's essentially Pascal's Wager in a nutshell. Now, there are some strengths and some weaknesses of Pascal's Wager, depending on who you are. So I asked you, what do you think the strengths of this argument is, and what are the weaknesses of the argument? And to start off with those who support Pascal's Wager. Now, if you're an individual who supports Pascal's Wager, you look at it and say, given the four outcomes, there is no doubt that logically there is only one desirable outcome. Okay, that's premise number one. Another idea you would have, if you maintain the premise that heaven and hell exist, Pascal is correct. If there is a 1% chance that heaven exists, considering all of the outcomes, you'd be a fool not to do whatever you had to do to get to heaven. And those who support Pascal's Wager, there's people who are adamant that there is a God. So atheism is a path to eternal suffering. Now, believers want to save people from this outcome. Now, Pascal is attempting to save these individuals. So these are people who support Pascal's Wager, and his three arguments were, number one, argument from superdominance. On a very simple level, God is or God isn't, and God is the prime mover, the super dominant force who has this dominance over all things, hegemony over all things. And that's one of his arguments. His second argument is the argument from expectation, that there is a mathematical expectation that God is statistically likely. And the third argument from is called the argument from generalized expectations, where essentially there's this generalized expectation that there is an afterlife one way or the other, and that it's good and that it's bad. So that's where Pascal is coming from. However, there are philosophical flaws, 9 to be exact. And before we get into those, a Calvin and Hobbes comic, because I grew up in the 80s and 90s, right? So here's Calvin and Hobbes, and Calvin says, well, I've decided I do believe in Santa Claus, no matter how preposterous it sounds. And Hobbes says, well, what convinced you? A simple risk analysis. I want presents, lots of presents. Why risk not getting them over a matter of belief? Heck, I'll believe anything they want. How cynically enterprising of you. It's the spirit of Christmas. So in a sense, Calvin was tapping into some of the flaws of Pascal's Wager. So flaw number one, is believing in God sufficient for salvation? Now, different belief systems have different paths of salvation. Now, this visual here comes from the Church of Latter-day Saints. This is their particular plan of salvation. Is belief enough? Does it cut it? I don't know. That's philosophical flaw number one. Philosophical flaw number two, which God must we believe in? Now, this is a chart of the religions from the present to the past. This is complicated. There have been thousands of deities throughout human history. So which God? So if you go with Pascal's Wager, and if you're born in a culture that is Buddhist culture and you adhere to the Buddhist traditions. Are you good? Same with Hindus or Judaism or Islam or Christianity. Does it matter? Which God must we believe in? That's flaw number 2. Now, flaw number 3, does any human belief matter? Can you have some sort of belief system, and as long as you believe, are you good? Similar to flaw number 2, and you can kind of see it has a similar vein. Now, flaw number 4, and this one's the controversial one. This one gets a reaction out of people. Is heaven better than hell? Now, if heaven is floating around on a cloud all day, strumming a harp, I don't know how long I could do that. Let's say it's 24/7 church service. Is that a good deal? Here's one that's a little more close to home. If you have friends that don't go to heaven and you have the knowledge that they are suffering in hell, how could you enjoy heaven knowing that loved ones are suffering for all eternity? So is heaven necessarily better than hell? That's philosophical flaw number 4. Now, philosophical flaw number 5, can one make themselves believe? I mean, can you do it? Now, if you're doing it along Pascal's wager and you're forcing yourself to believe, is a decision made with coercion and by force valid? Can one make themselves believe? That's flaw number 5. Now, flaw number 6, is a greedy decision valid? If you are saying, heck, I believe just to cover my backside, one of my favorite stories from U.S. history is Benjamin Franklin's funeral. And historians debate this, where through the streets of Philadelphia, every clergy from every faith walked in the funeral procession. Now, was that Franklin saying, hey, I want an ecumenical country where we all coexist? Or was he trying to cover his backside? Was he trying to hedge his bets? Now, if he was trying to hedge his bets and saying, hey, one of these people have to be right, is a greedy decision a valid decision? Philosophical flaw number 7. Can we guess God's criteria for salvation? Now, just check the internet. Type in salvation criteria, and different faiths see it very differently. How do we know? God's not going to tell us the criteria. So how do you know? That's flaw number 7. Flaw number 8. Now, Pascal is going from the premise that the probability of God is greater than 0. Is that necessarily true? So it's a mathematical argument. It's defeating the premise right out of the gate, saying, okay, Blaise Pascal, you say the probability of God's existence is greater than 0. Why? Why do you say that? What proof do you have of that? That's flaw number 8. And number 9 is probably the one that gets the most positive reaction, is that God is just. And if we are guessing, if there is only one path to salvation, one path to heaven, and God did create us all, why would he be discriminatory to who gets access to salvation? Perhaps God loves us all as human beings and will take care of all of us. And that's a very positive way of looking at it. Or if you are somebody where faith comes very easily versus somebody who's a cynic and a skeptic, well, why would God do that? Why would God create a skeptical person who gets punished for somebody compared to somebody who has easy faith? So that's the 9th philosophical flaw. So anyway, heavy duty stuff. And this is the journal entry once we're done. Is religious belief logical or illogical? Explain your rationale based on Pascal's wager and the class discussion. And I'm curious to what you say, because this is going to lead into metaphysics. And to me personally, I see Pascal's wager as that bridge from logic into metaphysics. And I hope you learned some things in logic. And remember, logic is a science that deals with the principles and criteria of validity, of inference, and demonstration, the science of the formal principles of reasoning. Whereas metaphysics is the branch of philosophy concerned with the study of the nature of being and beings, existence, time and space, and causality. So it's a different flavor. We're getting into the heavy stuff, if you will. And I hope it was a good unit, and I'm expecting metaphysics to be as good, if not better. So thank you for watching.